Ready to get started. I'm Joanna Cohn. I'm the director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control. It's nice to see obviously many familiar faces and some new ones. So we offer a Innovations in Tobacco Control seminar series generally every month, but with the end of the term coming, we have back-to-back ones. We've got another one tomorrow. Is Melinda here? Ashley, is it in the same room? I think we're back here tomorrow. So if you think you got a good lunch today, just come back tomorrow and it'll be another great lunch. But I'm really excited about today. We have a speaker who's come all the way from Atlanta, from the American Cancer Society, Dr. Jeffrey Drope. He is the research director of their Health Policy and Economics unit in Atlanta. And his doctoral training is in political science, so a bit different than a lot of people who come to tobacco control. His research interests lie in sort of the intersection, or where public health policy meets economics policy, trade policy, tax policy, and particularly in low and middle income countries. And he comes with a very practical perspective, so he is interested in how countries can implement both good public health policy as well as good economics policy that would ultimately lead to improved public health as well as economic prosperity. So he's going to share his insights with us. He's sort of in the middle of one, I don't know how much you're going to talk about anyway, so he'll share his insights with us and talk about sort of the complex intersection between tobacco control and trade liberalization. So thanks so much for being here, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for the introduction. Thank you to all of you for coming on your lunch hour. I know that selective incentives help, so I like the program where you get to come and have lunch and listen to somebody wax eloquent, hopefully. I'd like to thank the Institute for Global Tobacco Control, first for the invitation to come and speak today, and also actually for supporting some of this research. And in particular, I'd like to thank Professor Cohen, because she has been really very supportive of the work that my team and I are doing, and we're really excited to share some of that with you today. This is going to be a little bit of a bird's eye view. Some of the stuff that we're getting into is kind of technical and dry and boring. So I'm going to try to give a little bit more of an overview that hopefully will still be technically interesting to you as well, particularly those who have a lot of interest and experience in this area. Just before I begin, I want to just give a little shout out to my partners. I've got actually two sister projects going, one funded by the Institute for Global Tobacco Control here, and it is in the Philippines and Brazil. And we have terrific partners. Action for Economic Reforms in Manila, and our colleague Joy Chavez there. And then the National School of Public Health has a new, recently inaugurated Center for the Study of Tobacco and Health, led by Vera da Costa Silva, that some of you probably know. And she's doing a fantastic job there. And we're just delighted to be partners with both of these organizations. As well, the O'Neill Institute at Georgetown and the School of Physical and Occupational Therapy at McGill University. So it's you're getting some sense that it's quite a mixed team. I'm the only political scientist. They let me on the team, fortunately. So we have lawyers, we have an occupational therapist, health promotion specialists, physicians. So it's quite a great multidisciplinary team. And we mostly all get along, which is also very good. We have a sister project in Africa that is looking at very similar issues at the intersection of economic policy and tobacco control in several African countries. Our partner at the Center for Agricultural Research and Development in Malawi, the Population Health Institute, the University of Ottawa, not in Africa, clearly, School of Medicine at the University of Zambia, and Strathmore University in Kenya. So again, just a lot of really varied perspectives. And I have benefited hugely from working with these folks, and I'm very grateful to them. However, they take no responsibility for anything foolish that I say in the next 30 minutes or so. So that disclaimer there. All right. let's start with the ubiquitous why do we care question. I think it's always important to ask this because sometimes we lose focus of what we do and why we do it. Just before I jump into my answer, at least for this, I want to maybe have a quick definition here. I don't think I need to define public health or hopefully tobacco control, but I might want to just take a second to just define trade liberalization a little bit. What I mean by trade liberalization is actually in its sort of most pure economic form. It is simply the reduction of barriers to trading goods and services. So reducing tariffs, reducing non-tariff barriers like subsidies, phytosanitary regulations, all of the different types of barriers that exist to countries being able to trade their goods and services with each other. Okay, so why? Why do we care as public health researchers and hopefully proponents? Why do we care about this? Well, we know that under certain conditions, it's possible that economic policy can pose risks to governments' ability to regulate public health, okay? Probably the best and most prescient example I can give you right now is what's going on in terms of Australia and plain packaging. For those of you following this case, it has now gone to dispute resolution at the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and it's a really hot topic. In fact, a veritable cottage industry of academia has grown up around this one case, and I'm actually guilty as well. But it's a really interesting case that I'm not going to talk about today, and I'll explain why in a moment. But there's a wealth of literature out there on it, and it sort of explores a particular important case in terms of these conditions. What we know is that actors with health unfriendly, how's that for a euphemism? Health unfriendly goals will use economic agreements if they can to try to undermine our efforts to regulate public health. So there are sort of two dynamics going on here. We have one that's sort of purely economic, and I'll talk about that quite a bit today. We know that when you liberalize, it often leads to actually changes in the market conditions. In fact, it often leads to changes in price. Prices drop, consumption goes up. And for those of us who are interested in potentially unhealthy products, like nasty foods with trans fats or tobacco, alcohol, obviously in some circumstances, we're interested in these economic conditions that lead to these changes possibly, and then we're also interested in the policy conditions that lead to these changes. And the two things obviously happen at the same time. So today I'm going to try to disentangle some of this for us so that we can get some sense of what this means. So our overarching research question is, what are the effects of liberalization on tobacco control efforts? And I say tobacco control efforts because that can entail quite a lot of different things. It can entail policy, it can entail regulation, programs, enforcement. These are all sort of different pieces of the puzzle. It's not just legislation. So too often I have observed we get quite focused on the policy level and then we forget all the other things underneath. And trust me, the tobacco industry hasn't forgot about all those things underneath, and they're looking at it very, very closely to see where they can try to undermine our efforts to regulate effectively. Where should we start? Theory. Always a good place to start as social scientists, so that's where I'm going to start. The economic theory is actually pretty clear and pretty robust, and there are decades, if not centuries, of research that support a lot of these ideas. First of all, we know that trade liberalization, so the reduction of barriers to trade, should increase trade. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy proposition to test, right? Regional trade agreements, and I'll explain in a moment why we care about regional trade agreements, they should stimulate trade within the region with the agreement, right? So in the NAFTA, we have Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and the idea of NAFTA was that it would stimulate trade among these three countries. And in fact, it's precisely what it did. It varied across sectors, but certainly in the aggregate, what we saw was exactly what economic theory suggested we should see. Now, I'm not going to get into the related argument of whether or not this growth in trade actually leads to growth in development. That's just a Pandora's box I don't want to touch in this presentation. It's complicated, but those are two good starting points theoretically. The next one is increased trade should stimulate competition, right? So we get, with trading products or services, the introduction typically of new goods or services to a marketplace. And so firms are competing with each other to sell their goods or services. So it stimulates this competition. This increased competition then has a negative effect on price, because one way that firms can compete with other firms is to lower their prices. Typically, when you enter into a marketplace, unless you have really great product differentiation, you're not going to raise your prices to compete. So we see this effect on price. And from a public health perspective, we really care about this because we care whether or not people can afford to buy goods that might have harmful consequences. And then a positive effect on marketing as well. Again, when you're a new entrant to a marketplace, you want to make sure everybody knows that you're the new kid on the block and that your product is going to be better than everybody else's product, so you can sell lots of them. And then finally, these lower prices and increased marketing contribute, under certain conditions at least, to increased consumption, right? Lower prices, suddenly you're exposed to all of these messages that, I should smoke X brand of cigarettes, those types of things. Okay, so again, these are fairly easy things to test. Now, in terms of the policy regulatory theory, this is a little murkier, I have to say here. We don't exactly have the body of evidence that perhaps we would like, and my colleagues and I are working on this. But the gist of this is that membership in these economic agreements that seek to liberalize, seek to make economic barriers lower, can possibly constrain countries' abilities to regulate. And this can happen in areas of health. It can happen in other areas. Could be environment, could be labor, could be lots of areas, in fact. Remarkably, there isn't as much systematic research in this area as one might think. There's a lot of anecdotal research, say about Australia plain packaging, but looking at specific policy areas across time and across space, we still have a gap in the literature, and this is what partly what we're addressing in our research program. Let me just quickly, there are two ways. There can be direct challenges to countries' regulatory efforts. So the plain packaging is a direct challenge where Ukraine and a couple of other countries have said, look, Australia, you are violating your commitments to the World Trade Organization. Could also be regulatory chill. Okay, I really love that expression. I'm less convinced about this, and again, the research is even more sparse on regulatory chill, but the idea is that countries won't even regulate because they're afraid of what might happen if they regulate. And the best example I can give is a couple of months ago, for those of you who follow this, you probably recognize this story, but New Zealand announced very emphatically that they would love to have plain packaging of tobacco packages like their buddies over in Australia, but they're just going to wait to see what happens at the World Trade Organization, right? This could be regulatory chill. Could be other things, right? It's always hard to study the things that don't happen, right? We don't always have good explanations for the thing that never happened. And so, it could be, for example, and I'm not suggesting, in case there are any Kiwis here, I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily what New Zealand's doing, but it's really great political cover, right? You might wake up one morning and decide, you know what, I think plain packaging is really hard, and I can't be bothered, and I also get a lot of contributions from the tobacco industry, so I'm not going to do it. But I'm going to tell everyone it's because of this regulatory uncertainty, right? And this is, I think, what we see a lot in countries. And so it's not so much regulatory chill as just a really lame excuse. Yes, Steve?
The UK followed New Zealand's example.
I didn't see that. What tragic news. When in fact we need exactly the opposite. And I'm going to, spoiler alert here, but my suggestion would be if everyone would just jump on board and just start doing it, I think it would in fact overwhelm the tobacco industry. But we'll get there in a second. That's really, it's a bit of a downer. Thanks, Steve. So I'm going to evaluate some of these propositions that I've just introduced here. And I'm going to use a case study of one important region, Southeast Asia. From a social scientific perspective, I like to use the case study of a region because we get better analytical leverage with 10 countries than we do with one, right? So there are several options here. We could choose one country. We could take the United States and look across policy areas. We could take one policy area, say packaging, and look at the Australia plain packaging case or the Uruguay warning labels case. But I'm going to actually look across the 9 or 10 countries as the data permit and look at Southeast Asia. And the reason we chose Southeast Asia is I would call it a most likely case. We actually expect to see some, if you will, confrontation or some sort of tension between trade liberalization and public health in this region. And one reason is, in recent years, it's actually liberalized a lot. For those of you familiar with the region, there's the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, and they have a free trade agreement, the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, which of course goes by AFTA, right? It rolls off the tongue nicely, rhymes with NAFTA. So they have AFTA, and it was a really fairly ambitious effort in the early 2000s to liberalize trade, first by tariff reduction, and we saw major liberalization. So we saw tariff levels drop from 60, 70, 80% to 5 or 0. So really vigorous tariff reduction and the reduction of other types of trade barriers as well. At the same time, we actually know that there is deep concern in the region that public health is coming under fire because of this liberalization. Any of you, and I'll refer to this case in a little bit, but any of you familiar with the very famous case at the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade at the GATT in 1990 between the United States and Thailand, when the United States was a big bully and made Thailand actually get rid of its import ban on cigarettes. But it's a very famous and important case in international law and really anything to do with health and international law and trade. So it sort of started then. I remember a piece from 2000 that was in tobacco control, and this was some of the sort of eminent figures in tobacco control in Thailand. And they said that it was a warning. It said, you know, AFTA is going to spell the demise of tobacco control in the region. And so it was a, you know, cautionary tale. We can actually evaluate today whether or not that did indeed happen. Last summer, the AFTA health ministers all got together and released a declaration that tobacco should be excluded from the next iteration of the AFTA agreement that's coming online in 2015. This is, they're actually going from being a sort of free trade area to being an economic community, which is the next step in terms of greater integration economically. So we see a lot of concern. For those of you familiar with the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, at the Conference of Parties in November in Seoul, the Philippines, quite out of the blue for everybody, came up with this, again, this proposal, almost a declaration that tobacco should be excluded from trade agreements and that the FCTC should be incorporated into all trade agreements. It didn't get anywhere, but you get the sense that this is obviously an area of concern in the region. And so if it is an area of concern, you know, we should look to it to see what's really going on here. So I'm going to march through some of those theoretical constructs that I introduced a minute ago. Let's start with the easy one, trade. Did trade go up in tobacco products when the AFTA came online? So if we look at our timeline here, it starts in 1999. Keep in mind that AFTA came online in 2003. Typically, it's introduced somewhat incrementally. In some cases, it was introduced, you know, cold turkey. In most cases, it took place over a few years. But what we should see is an increase, probably both in exports and in imports for some, if not most, countries of the agreement. And what do we actually see? We actually really only see one major change in terms of exports. And the most substantial change we see is this pretty green line here, and that is Indonesia. Indonesian exports to its neighbors within the trade agreement shot up. And that's significant and important, and I'll get back to that in a moment. Interestingly, Singapore has dropped off and then picked back up to more or less their same level from before the trade agreement. We see a little bit of incremental change in the Philippines, but if you think about that in real dollar terms, 100 million US dollars isn't actually very much. So it's not quite the change that we would expect to see. In terms of imports, we see a little bit more of a clearer pattern that theory would predict. We see at least 4 countries within the region where the imports coming from their free trade neighbors increased, okay? So what we might see going on here with exports, it could be that Indonesia had the comparative advantage, and they were just really good at exporting. And the reason why we only see change there is because they are good at it. I'm skeptical that's the explanation. I think it's actually much more complex than that. I'm a little bit surprised here in imports that we don't see growth in all the other countries in terms of getting more imports from their neighbors. That is what regional trade agreements are typically supposed to do, especially in an area like tobacco, which is a pretty low-priced product. So it's interesting to see that we don't quite see theory performing as we would expect. It's not terrible, but it's certainly not perfect, and suggests that there's a bigger picture here. I'm going to cut the data in a slightly different way. This is actually the change in proportion of total trade, exports again and imports on the right side, and looking at whether or not the actual total proportion of trade within the trade agreement went up in these countries. And again, we see some actually pretty surprising results. The big change that we see is this pretty purple line here, right? Where we see a huge spike. That's the Philippines. And that suggests to us that the Philippines had been trading with other countries. As a matter of fact, it had been trading with Europe and the United States. So it had been actually making its cigarettes in the Philippines and putting them on boats and sending them across the Pacific. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right, when you can sell them to, say, Thailand, which is where it now, in fact, sells them. Thanks to the United States, by the way, breaking down those barriers back in 1990. But what's interesting is we don't see it very much across the other countries. With imports, we see a slightly clearer picture again. We see the proportions of trade within the trade agreement increasing significantly for some countries, although not all. So again, theory performs okay. And again, it makes us ask, why is it only performing okay and not really, really well? So we have to ask ourselves, what were the effects of these changes in tobacco trade flows? This change, this anticipated change that suddenly there would be this huge variety of goods that we would expect all of these new tobacco firms entering the marketplace. They would be competing, price would be dropping, there would be, a million different brands, and there'd be 103% prevalence. But did we see this? Well, it's interesting how you try to measure these things. I'm going to start with price. And rather than look at price, which I think is a typically problematic measure, price is problematic because it can be affected by other significant variables, in particular inflation and changes in income, okay? So it can make it look like there's been a huge price increase, only to find out that disposable incomes actually went up more quickly, or that inflation wiped away any of those price increases as well, okay? And it could be wage inflation as well. So my colleagues, Corné van Walbeek and Evan Bletcher, have been doing some great work on affordability. And they actually tried to get around this problem by looking at how affordable cigarettes are. And in particular, their measure is what proportion of average income does it take to buy 100 packs of the most popular brand of cigarettes, right? So you figure 6 to 8 cigarettes a day, which is not unreasonable at all. And they came up with this fantastic figure, and they have generously given me the data. And we can actually look at changes in cigarette affordability across these countries. Now let's bear in mind what theory suggests we should see. We should see all those pretty wiggly lines going down. And what do we see? We see at least half of those wiggly lines going up. High performer, the pretty purple line up there, is Malaysia. Cigarettes are actually half as affordable now as they were 14 years ago. That's hugely consequential. What's more is that this happened in an area of actually pretty steady and rapid economic growth. So that means that the price of cigarettes was outpacing those other changes in terms of disposable income growth and inflation. The big loser at the bottom is that red line, and that is Cambodia. So if any of you are thinking of smoking or are heavy smokers, you should move to Cambodia because they're ridiculously inexpensive in Cambodia. The other not winner there is the Philippines. What's interesting is hopefully this is going to change. In January, we observed the largest single tobacco tax increase in the contemporary history of low and middle income countries. And so we hope that this is going to take a bite out of this downward trend in affordability. But more broadly speaking, returning to our task at hand, what's really interesting is that we look at the high performers, if you will, there: Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore. They also happen to be, notably, some of the most open economies generally and open tobacco sectors. Again, precisely the opposite of what we should expect to see. So it makes you think, well, what is going on here? I don't understand this scenario. So the more trade open economies are the ones where we're actually seeing affordability change for the better, for public health, okay? So this is really important, and we need to try to understand this. I'm going to cut these data another way again. I'd love to have time series prevalence data for you, and any of you who work in Southeast Asia know that they're not so good, especially across a number of countries. So instead, I'm going to just throw up a little per capita cigarette consumption for this time period. It's not a perfect measure, obviously, per capita consumption, but it's not a terrible measure, and this allows us to look across a bunch of these countries, 9 I think I had data for, and look at the general trends. Again, we've got some winners and losers here. Our winners are this pretty purple line, Malaysia again. This line here, it's Singapore. So lo and behold, the countries where cigarettes became less affordable also saw decreases in per capita consumption. Now here's a really interesting scenario. See our big loser here is this light green line. That's Vietnam. And the really notable part of the story is that Vietnam is the only one with a tobacco exclusion in the AFTA agreement. So they're the only ones that didn't have to liberalize their tobacco sector. They remain protected, okay? So if you know this literature at all, you might know the work by Frank Chalupka in the 1990s that looked at the liberalization, the forced liberalization, but again, by the United States, not a pretty part of our history, the forced liberalization of tobacco markets in Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. And what we learned in those particular circumstances was that when they liberalized those very closed cigarette sectors, there was a massive decrease in price and a massive increase in consumption. Now, there's a huge caveat when you actually read those papers really carefully, and they say, look, these market conditions are very specific. These are state-owned monopolies that don't seem to care a whole lot about selling cigarettes. So they weren't marketing aggressively, they weren't selling cigarettes all that cheaply, and as a consequence, the rates of consumption were actually pretty low. Unfortunately, we're not seeing the same thing here. And as you can see from Vietnam, apparently the state-owned monopoly in Vietnam didn't get the memo, and they're quite happy to be selling cheap cigarettes and lots and lots and lots of them and more every year, okay? It'll be really interesting to see what happens with Vietnam. I'll talk about this in a moment, but with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the big partnership amongst, well, now more than 10 Pacific Rim countries who are trying to come up with a new and better trade deal. One of the big concerns is that the Vietnam tobacco sector will have to be opened up under this agreement. And when I look at this figure, I think to myself, wow, their consumption actually doubled in about a decade. Either we are not going to see this or it's going to get even worse than we could have possibly imagined. But it will be interesting to see how this relationship unfolds if it does. So you ask yourself, why these discrepancies in data? He is not telling a very compelling narrative whatsoever. The easy answer is tobacco control policy, right? That's a really easy answer. The other easy answer, I suppose, is the FCTC, right? The FCTC came into force right in the middle of all this in 2005. I would argue that these things are consequential and do help us to understand the picture, except that, of course, the causal errors are going both ways, right? So it's not a very compelling explanation, or it is also a very, very complex simultaneous equations model too, right? That you've got policy affecting tobacco trade and tobacco consumption, and vice versa. You've got tobacco trade and tobacco consumption affecting policy. So you have a really quite a mess here. But let's concentrate for a moment on these three major articles of the FCTC. We've got Articles 8, 11, and 13. So bans on tobacco advertising, promotion, and sponsorship, warning labels, and smoke-free places, right? And we're looking at relative performance. And if there are any experts here on Southeast Asia, forgive me, this is a little bit crude. But it serves the purpose of showing us who the high performers are and who the low performers are, and then being able to relate it back again to our hypotheses about how trade should or could be affecting it. I'll make it a little easier for us there. We've got our high performers, our medium performer, and then our weakest. And then I created a third category, right? And that's the weak but getting better. So I gave a few props to Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam because they are getting better. Now, the benchmark was like way down here, but they're for sure getting better. And this is really important. First of all, there's two relationships I want to highlight. One is we're actually seeing improvement almost throughout the whole region. Indonesia, well, it's a separate issue. It needs some attention. Myanmar, they're just working out their whole political situation right now. We'll cut them some slack, okay? They've got bigger fish to fry at the moment, although you might make the argument this is the perfect time to jump in and try to affect policy. But really across the board in ASEAN, we're seeing really, really positive change. Some really dramatic, right? Certainly Thailand has always been a high performer since the early 1990s. But we're seeing, Singapore continues to lead the way. Malaysia's getting better. Brunei has recently improved, very recently improved. The Philippines, especially with this new tax increase, we're really starting to see positive public health change in this area. And this is good news. But what's really fabulously interesting to me is that this is happening at the exact same time as massive trade liberalization, right? Again, kind of counter to what a lot of people suggest should happen. And it, again, makes us wonder, well, why is this? I don't understand. These relationships sure aren't very clear. So, could it be the direct challenges to tobacco control? So far, I don't think so. We don't actually know of a lot of direct challenges to tobacco control regulations via, for example, the AFTA or even other policies. Some of you might be familiar, there was a very well-known case between Thailand and the Philippines recently over tobacco taxation. I would argue that that was much more really a pure economic issue and had very little to do with public health. Obviously it had public health ramifications, but really the core of the arguments weren't the usual ones that we're seeing, like the ones we're seeing in plain packaging or warning labels elsewhere. So we're not seeing a lot of these direct challenges. I certainly hear stories, anecdotal stories about, I think PMI threatened to sue the Ministry of Health in Malaysia over their proposed warning labels. I think that maybe it was BAT threatened to sue the MOH in Thailand again. I think it was over warning labels. You get the idea, but nothing has come to fruition in these international fora quite yet. And that's interesting and consequential, I think. So what's going on here? Does the theory that I outlined at the beginning help us? I think it does. I think it's a really useful starting point to know which way to expect the relationships to play out. As I've demonstrated, they don't play out perfectly, and it makes us, I guess, go back to the theoretical drawing board and question whether or not we're actually hitting the variables that we need to be hitting. Something that I'm working on with all of my colleagues on these two projects is investment by transnational tobacco companies. I think this is a hugely consequential variable, among a number of other important ones. Just want to throw up an alternative explanation here. Why does this matter? Well, my suggestion is that trade is just one part of something, strategy, if you will, that the tobacco industry has to incorporate into its thinking, right? And it's really interesting because sometimes free trade is really good for the tobacco industry, and sometimes it turns out free trade is really bad for the tobacco industry. If you've heard of the Pacific Island Countries Trade Agreement, PICTA, another great acronym, PICTA. PICTA had, and still has, I believe it wasn't overturned as of yet, it has a tobacco exclusion. So tobacco is excluded from the trade agreement. You know, whatever applies to everything else doesn't apply to tobacco. I recently learned from one of the people that negotiated this deal that the chief proponent of this tobacco exclusion was BAT. They wanted to protect their market share. And they figured the best way to do it was to actually stymie trade for other firms, other multinational firms. Likewise, there's an economic partnership agreement between South Africa and the EU. There's an abrogation, which is similar to an exclusion, just a longer, fancier word, for tobacco. And it was, again, BAT, because they wanted to keep PMI out of South Africa because they want to protect their very dominant market share there. So what we see is that trade it's not exactly the way that you might expect it to be. And the tobacco industry thinks, I think, a lot about how it plays into their broader strategy. And turns out they can work it from just about every angle. They can work it from the free trade angle, and they can work it from the protection angle. And this makes it really difficult as public health proponents for us to figure out what they're doing from day to day. And it makes it really uncompelling as social scientists because it makes a lot of these explanations very particularistic, which is very unsatisfying for those positivists in the room, including myself. It's hard. Let me just show you what it looks like. Again, it's a bit of a messy table here, but the gist of this is the tobacco industry has pretty thoroughly penetrated these markets, right? If they're not doing it by imports and exports, no worries, we'll set up a factory here. If we can't set up a factory here, you know what we'll do? We'll partner with the dominant domestic firm and we'll manufacture cigarettes with them. It's like they have an answer for every single one of the strategies that we come up with. And I think that it is part of this complexity that helps us to understand why all of those relationships that I showed on the colorful graphs before were really confusing, right? Because the industry knows that there are lots of different strategies for working this, okay? So it's something to think about and something that we're working on very, we're trying to be very rigorous and trying to understand what strategies the industry uses in different situations. When are they going to invest? When are they going to trade? When are they going to form partnerships? And then how does it affect the overall political economy in these countries, right? So right now in Brazil, for example, you know, we have BAT as the dominant firm there, and you know, they're finding ways, I think, through their investment in the industry and their broader investments in terms of the supply chain, trying to figure out creative ways of affecting the political process. And this is really important, and it's important for us to understand what's going on across different regions in the world. There are lots of differences, but I have to say there are also lots of similarities, which gives us some analytical leverage to work with. So what's our conclusion? Here's the most satisfying conclusion that I'm going to give you here. Unsatisfying conclusion. It's complicated. It's complex. It's both of these things. Again, it's really hard to nail down what are these precise relationships. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to be systematic about it, but we have to recognize that it is really inherently complex. And what I see a lot is way too many assumptions on the part of the public health community, where there's an automatic condemnation of trade or trade agreements. Believe me, I think they pose a genuine risk in particular circumstances, and I'm worried about it. And I do go to bed at night worried about it. But But that said, the discourse that I have heard around the world about, well, health should trump trade, it's not quite that simple. And there are ways that we can cut this again to shed some better light on it. So what's our way forward? I'm not going to leave you totally hanging here and tell you that we can't figure this out. Let me just run down this, I think, list of 5 important areas that we need to target, among others. In addition to the investment feature that I just talked about, I think there are at least 5 others. There was a great commentary in the Lancet in the last couple issues. I don't know if some of you saw it, on trade. And they mentioned a couple of these. It was by 2 Australian academics. It was a very good paper, so if you happen to be breezing through the Lancet, check it out, because they had some interesting things to say, thoughtful things. This idea of investor-state dispute settlement, it's really complicated, but in every type of economic agreement, there are lots of ways that countries settle their disputes with each other. In the World Trade Organization, we actually have a dispute settlement understanding. And it's interesting because countries take on other countries in this dispute understanding, okay? So right now, Ukraine is taking on Australia and over plain packaging. And what's interesting too is it is based on retaliation. So if the WTO decides that Australia has violated its commitments to the WTO, Ukraine will be allowed to retaliate against Australia, okay? You have to think about that conceptually. In investor-state dispute settlement, most of these ISDS systems, firms have legal standing, not countries, okay? This is a very different dynamic if you think about it. This is why Philip Morris can take on Uruguay, right? Otherwise, Philip Morris probably would have had a tough time finding somebody, let's say Switzerland, where it's based, to take on Uruguay at, say, the World Trade Organization. So instead, they take it to investor-state dispute settlement. Turns out that Switzerland and Uruguay had this old agreement from years ago where they have one of these built in. And you can take these cases, firms can take countries to arbitration, international arbitration, which live up to their name because they're quite arbitrary a lot of the time, right? They're arbitrary. They work on very not transparent principles, and a lot of times they actually provide for compensation. And you can imagine that small countries like Uruguay aren't very well equipped to deal with this type of thing. And quite frankly, if it weren't for help from abroad, they probably wouldn't have taken on this case. This is really important. So you can thank Mayor Bloomberg for helping the Uruguayans on this, because it's a really important case that cannot be dismissed. And conceptually, it's important because we can't have big, huge firms picking on smaller countries, because they can. Intellectual property rights protections. This is a lot of what is at the core of the whole Australia plain packaging. What are countries' trademark rights? Does having a trademark just let you do whatever you want, unfettered, for example, from governments trying to protect their citizens in science-based, non-discriminatory ways, right? Australia's not picking on one brand of cigarette. They're saying, look, we've tried all these things, and our prevalence rates, we're barely, they're stuck. And so now we're going to try this. And, in this case, we're allowed to. You don't have, if you will, the positive right to use your trademarks however you want. And so this is going to be a really interesting case, and I think there's going to be a lot more on intellectual property issues. And I guarantee you the industry's thinking a lot about this. Trade and services, another really interesting one. Advertising, marketing, point of sale, all of these things fall under, in some ways, services. And I think we're just sort of beginning to see the tip of the iceberg. We saw a case in Norway with point of sale in terms, again, or what are firms' rights to trade services, in this case, advertising services. Got some trademark issues in that case as well. The fourth point I want to make is about special exceptions for health. For those of you, and I'm sure many of you have read the agreement between Switzerland and Uruguay, their bilateral investment treaty, great reading. But there is actually a special exception for health in there. And it always amazes me how poorly we assert our special exceptions. And frankly, how poorly we incorporate them into new agreements. And we have some perfect moments here. We have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is, I think, in round 17 of negotiations this week in Lima, Peru, I think. And then the new transatlantic partnership that's going to be between the United States and the EU and probably other countries, which has the very awkward acronym of TTIP. I don't even remember what it stands for, but in any event, I really think it's important to think about what special exceptions we can effectively work into them, and we need to look, again, across time and across space to see which ones work and which ones don't. And then the last point goes back to, does trade trump health or does health trump trade? The fact is, that's just a very facile treatment of a very complex set of issues. We actually can think about ways to make economic policy that engender prosperity and public health policy that promotes society-level positive public health outcomes, right? It is possible to have these two things together, and we actually have the expertise to be able to do that. We just have to have some will, a collective will amongst countries and how we organize ourselves. But we really have to be cognizant of the fact that there has to be coherence among all of these different policies. So at that, I will happily take some questions.
So your last slide, one of the things you mentioned was exceptions for health.
Yes.
And are there precedents in other sectors for that, sort of like environment,
Yeah.
other things? Is that sort of done?
Unfortunately, I wish I could say yes. For those of you familiar with the Article 20B under GATT, it actually unfortunately covers both health and environment. So basically anything that's bad for people or the things around us. And quite frankly, I think that the environmental folks are struggling with really similar issues. And it may be a case that we need to get together and talk to our colleagues who are struggling with these same issues across environment and other areas and find out what brilliant strategies that they're thinking of employing. It seems to me that there are a lot of synergies to exploit here. The problem a lot of the time, I think, is there's a little bit of a we'll look after ourselves mentality, that we're fine to protect our interests, but we don't maybe work very hard to protect other interests that are equally valid. But it's a great point, and sadly I can report that there aren't great precedents from other areas yet. But maybe they'll come up with something brilliant that we can just copy. Good question, though.
Which I fully understand, but no, I don't understand the intellectual property rights issues. Can you talk through how that
Sure.
plays out in Australia?
Yeah. So the big, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to preface my remarks by saying I'm not a lawyer. But one of the core arguments is whether or not you have a negative or a positive right to your trademark, okay? And what this means is the tobacco industry would like to think that it has a positive right, if you will, to its trademark. It can use its trademark for anything, right? And that isn't at all, if you read, for example, TRIPS, the intellectual property agreement under the WTO, or if you even go to sort of its precursor, which is the Paris Conventions, and you read it, that's actually not what it says. What it suggests is that the government has to protect firms' trademarks from third parties. It doesn't actually say that the government has to protect firms' trademarks from the government itself trying to regulate for broader, welfare maximization of society. So it's really interesting. I think that the Australians are going to win this case, knock on wood. I think that they have a really strong case in their interpretation of this body of international law. I think that the case that they're making, that governments absolutely have the right to if you will, prevent industries, firms from using their trademarks if it is for the betterment of a societal end, in this case protecting human health. But that is not how the industry, in fact, the industry feels so strongly that their trademarks are being expropriated, they love this word, that they're seeking compensation. So they're saying, look, our trademark's being expropriated by the government. You're saying we can't use our brand, right? Our pretty red package with stars and circles. And that is precluding us from selling as many cigarettes as we should and want to be able to sell. And then therefore you should compensate us for that expropriated trademark. Does that help? So it's really about interpretation. I think, I mean, I've read this stuff time and time again, and I frankly don't know how they're coming to that, well, I know how they're coming to that conclusion because it's quite convenient. And I think most self-respecting trademark lawyers that I know are firmly on Australia's side.
So this is about trademark rather than intellectual property in terms of like the content. You couldn't expand what they're saying on trademark to the content of the cigarette.
That's a really interesting point. And there are conversations going on in other places where they're talking about disclosure of ingredients. And so this is really interesting. In fact, Brazil, Roberto, is an interesting case because the regulatory agency there has to be very careful about how it collects information because there's great fear that someone's going to run in and discover that, that ammonia that you put in your cigarette makes your cigarettes taste extra good and is the reason for your great success, right? So that's a separate set of intellectual property issues that's absolutely germane as well. And I expect will continue to play a role in how the industry tries to challenge our efforts to regulate tobacco, particularly across additives, flavorings, et cetera. Yeah, absolutely. Another really good question because it's a separate issue, sadly. Yes?
Have you looked at in your research how trade liberalization impacts the trade of smuggled products?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a huge literature on this. This is not my area of expertise. It is actually interesting because that tends to be linked much more closely to the tax literature because what we typically see is great dispute about whether or not increased taxation, especially when there's differential tax rates in contiguous or somewhat contiguous places, that, country X has a 60% tax rate and country Y has a 10% tax rate, and therefore, of course, you get the smuggled cigarettes from one zone, the lower taxation zone, to the higher tax zone. There's a huge literature on this. I can tell you, I'll give you the highlights of that literature. The highlight of the literature is, sure, there's an increase in taxation when there are price differentials an increase in smuggled cigarettes when there's a price differential for tax or other reasons. The good news is, from a taxation perspective, is those losses, if you will, to smuggled cigarettes in terms of tax revenue never ever come anywhere close to the gains that you get from both a revenue perspective and a public health perspective from raising the prices of tobacco products through taxation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, that part.
Yeah.
I was just curious if trade liberalization did anything more beyond that. I know I'll just say because we just came back from collecting some tax from the Philippines, and probably maybe half of the sample came from other countries.
Yeah.
It's still to be determined whether or not they were legally, brought there or if they were smuggled. But
Yeah.
we were surprised by how many came from Thailand and Vietnam and many of the other Asian countries within the region. So I was just, curious,
Yeah.
given, the trade policy, if it impacts at all.
Theory suggests that with trade liberalization, you should see less smuggling, right? Because that's one more set of barriers that you see a great equalization, right? And so the only non-equalization then happens on tax, right, and production costs. I would suggest, I'm going to go out on a limb here, that a lot of what you're seeing has been completely artificially manufactured by the tobacco industry. I think they really want us to believe that this tax increase. When did you get back from the Philippines? Yeah. My guess is they really, really want policymakers and everybody else to think that this has been catastrophic for the domestic tobacco production, and that the sky is definitely falling because of the massive tobacco tax increase there. I would be very, very surprised, just knowing how cheap cigarettes are made in the Philippines, if it's really worth their while even to smuggle cigarettes from other places. So I'm extremely skeptical that those data are representing, if you will, the actual illicit trade and not illicit trade that's concocted by the industry. That'd be my guess. Steve?
A little bit on the same subject. Isn't there a part of that after that grants member countries by the preferential treatment of free trade, which might explain why there's more cigarettes from Vietnam and Malaysia and
Yeah.
places like that rather than from Canada and the United States.
Right. No, absolutely. You know, that's the whole design, obviously, of the AFTA agreement, is to exploit, if you will, those regional efficiencies. And so, yes, there's absolutely preferential treatment. If you look, in fact, I think I have a slide here. Yeah. So the column one there are the applied most favored nation rates from the WTO, and you can see that in a lot of cases they're significantly higher, right? So like look at Thailand is 60% versus 0. Now the Philippines, it's 10 versus 0, which is interesting to think about, right? They're liberalized globally rather than just regionally. But yeah, absolutely, there's certainly an element of you would expect to see packages from regional neighbors precisely because of this.
And Philip Morris seems to be way out front in understanding all of this back in 2000 when they went around trying to establish all these joint ventures.
Yeah.
Within ASEAN.
Yeah. No, actually, their strategy was simply brilliant, I have to say. Yeah. I don't really love to give them compliments, but you know, from the perspective of a trade specialist, I can tell you that they really know their stuff. they really know how to take advantage of these economic situations to the very best of their ability. I think something that we're pursuing, and we're finding some difficulty in finding good data, is profitability. And so we're trying to find some really good time series cross-national data on profitability to see, because we think that's another part of this picture, is how successfully are they using these trade and investment strategies to enhance profitability. Profitability is a really hard thing to, you know, there are many determinants to profitability, obviously, but it would be interesting to be able to look at these relationships because, as you've said, I mean, and it's not just Southeast Asia. Our project in Africa, BAT has 3 manufacturing hubs now in Africa, in Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, and they know exactly where the free trade agreements, and they know exactly what the trends are in terms of trade policies, and they situate themselves perfectly to maximize their efficiency and their profitability, presumably. So they're way ahead of the curve. We're catching up. Yes. Smoking baby, no.
Well, it's like an internet phenomenon, but there's an expose about how, marketing to children and marketing to out of control in Indonesia. I'm curious if there's any, you mentioned that Indonesia was kind of like an outlier out there. What's your take on it?
I don't know the case terribly well. I'm starting to get to know it better. Mainly because it has a lot of, obviously, interactive effects with what we're looking at in Southeast Asia. I think you have a tobacco industry, a domestic tobacco industry that is thoroughly integrated into the political elite. That would be my short answer for you. I really believe that it is hard to differentiate between political and economic elites more generally in a place like Indonesia. But it's for a country of 200 plus